What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a way in which I think Steam could stand to improve. Because I use Steam a lot. In fact, I would say, given the Steam replays they've been doing recently, probably more than like 99% of people without exaggerating. And while, if I'm being completely honest, this is not something I expect to ever happen, I do think Steam could take some initiative and potentially provide some real feedback via its own users about the sort of overall technical state of a game. But as we jump into this, feel free to just listen to this one. I'm just going to have some B-roll in the background because I suppose while I could show you some various elements of Steam's overall UI, that doesn't feel particularly necessary, frankly. But the other part of this is that I'm mostly kind of just spitballing here. I was talking about performance recently with Oblivion Remastered, and I mentioned that while I acknowledge that game's performance is not where it needs to be, there's a lot of other nuances to that conversation that people tend to avoid. And I say that as somebody who talks about the performance of a game in basically every review that I do. And I fully admit, even what I'm capable of reporting here in that regard is relatively limited because I have exactly one set of hardware. So I was thinking about ways that a sort of problem could be tackled and countered just by mass information, which would potentially be able to capture some of that nuance that I was actually talking about. I love PC gaming. This is a PC channel as it happens, and while I review many games that are on consoles and eventually come to PC, I game on PC because that is where I am most comfortable. In fact, one of the big reasons I prefer it is that it enables me to troubleshoot problems much more directly than I can on a console. And as somebody who reviews games for a living, that's actually really important for me. If you've watched any of my reviews or heard me talk about it previously, I'm pretty comfortable with that. In fact, everything from using a hex editor, editing a file directly, I don't have any problems doing any of that myself. But reality is that most people are not comfortable doing that, frankly. And in fact, I would actually go so far as to say that when people buy a game, the sort of bare minimum there is that it is expected to, run. And so, obviously, feedback about a game running very poorly is important. As the absolute base minimum for a video game in terms of that is that it actually has to, work. It has to be playable. And a lot of that is, of course, on the developer. They actually have to make a functional product at the end of the day. And yet, for PC more so than console, due to a variety of hardware variations, and even some software stuff we'll get into in a moment, that's a lot easier said than done. And in fact, because of the just sort of wide range of an impossible amount of hardware configurations, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not, some of the problems people encounter with games does come down to user error. It could be something as simple as you are using an outdated driver which prevents a game from running. It could be not having a redistributable for some reason. Some games just don't like specific lines of CPUs. There are games that are better off running with a single core enabled as opposed to, the many cores of a CPU these days. There's a variety of reasons that a game not running on PC might completely be on the side of the user trying to play the game and have nothing to do with the way the game itself was necessarily developed. Probably the easiest example of this is that, if you are playing a game that you have a computer below the minimum specs for, that's kind of on you. Especially on Steam, where those specs are displayed right on the store page. Like, you bought that game knowing that full well. Or at least you should have, anyway. And I say should have specifically because, being informed is both an active process, but also you have to, ideally, be working with platforms and things that go out of their way to inform you, like with minimum specs on a Steam page, as an example. So, one of the ways I was thinking in which we could actually sort of address this problem is by either attaching some of this information by opt-in, obviously, to either Steam Review itself or as an entirely separate sort of review entry for a game. Now, I do want to stress right here that this would be entirely opt-in if it were to ever happen, ideally. But something like Steam taking a quick look at your hardware specs and then just attaching that to the review itself could potentially be really useful because it would allow you to get an idea, especially if Steam would be willing to aggregate it in some way, like make a chart, that kind of thing out of all the data, or at least have it automated to do so, which is one of many reasons I don't think this is going to ever actually happen, mind you. But still, if they would be willing to take that data, pull it all together and be like, this is how this game is running for these sets of hardware, as an example, would obviously be extremely beneficial for people to get like a sort of actual look at, again, the sort of standard set of hardware that people are running the game on for the most part, on top of, how they feel that the game is running for them specifically. Now, the catch is, while it would probably be easy enough, I think, to attach a set of hardware to it, what would actually probably be a little more difficult is the non-hardware side of things. So that would be things like, what resolution is the game being played in? What are the actual in-game settings? What is the driver they have installed, as an example? So that would also be important information, which would obviously complicate this almost immediately, because while you could certainly do things like driver versions and things installed, obviously getting anything close to a standardized assessment of what in-game options look like would be a big deal. But for instance, if you are running a very low-end PC and trying to run a game on a high graphical preset that you just don't have the computer for, it's obviously not going to run for you very well. But, again, just reporting that would be really difficult. And while I do, again, think Steam could, if they wanted to, pour a little bit of attention here into, say, having games maybe be like, these are what the potential options are for, in-game settings, and then potentially have people self-report this, but obviously then that is a little prone to abuse. But given that Steam itself is hardly a stranger to user abuse at times via things like review bombs and whatnot, that it wouldn't exactly be an unheard of thing to happen over there. But I think the main thing this would help is just that having all of these people, if they are willing at least, to sort of offer up what their current settings are and, their own hardware and everything. So you could, at mass, get an exact sort of idea of how this game is running on individual bits of hardware, how people are adjusting individual settings and whatnot, could provide people potentially a lot of extremely valuable information when, say, looking at a Steam page or just browsing reviews for a given game. Because while it is one thing for reviews to be like, hey, this game isn't running well, I think it would be much more helpful to be able to break that down potentially into like, what are these individual users even in aggregate experiencing that is causing this problem, which could potentially even help developers given, what kind of telemetry data they're receiving, which is already a different thing. But my point is, I think this would be something that could be really helpful, especially on a game-to-game basis. Now, to reiterate, I don't think Steam is ever going to do this. They tend to take a very hands-off approach with most things. And then, of course, there's the other side of that. Some people just might not be comfortable sharing that information, which is why I mentioned that ideally this would all obviously be completely opt-in and optional, not entirely dissimilar from their hardware survey. But ultimately, my point is this. There's a lot of nuance to these conversations that, unfortunately, it's really difficult to get to the bottom of, especially as any just one individual person, because I can talk about how a game performed for me on my singular set of hardware, and yes, I have even seen people be like, oh, you could just buy like a different mid-range setup, and then it's like, yeah, sure, man, and then I gotta run a game for an extensive period of time on multiple setups when I'm already on a time crunch. And to give you an idea of how much of an effort that is, there's entire channels dedicated to doing basically just that, and even then, those channels have their limitations because there's only so many hardware configurations you could realistically test this on by yourself. And much like when a game releases and potentially millions of people play it for the first time, they inevitably find bugs that the QA process did not and probably could not just through sheer brute force. I think there is potential here to take, again, just all of that data and actually put it to use if people and Steam would be willing to do so. Now, before we wrap this up, to sort of flip this and sort of talk about the other side, because I have no doubt that people have had this conversation before, the first and most obvious one is simply that it would rely on human trust, which, as history has proven, invariably is spotty at best, as I alluded to earlier. You would ultimately have to trust that people are telling the truth and not deliberately trying to skew the metrics in some way. And while you could obviously say, let Steam just pull that data all on its own if you opted into it, the issue there would be that whether or not what data actually gets pulled is accurate, as, believe it or not, especially with some shady hardware, it doesn't always actually broadcast what it is correctly. You see that occasionally with like ID software for things like CPUs and GPUs and whatnot. What the GPU says it is on an actual computer versus what it was sold to you as doesn't always line up per se. So even there's some potential flaws. Another problem is that honestly it could just lead to more arguing about it. As I mentioned, I would obviously like to see this sort of capture the nuance of the broader conversation around performance, but things don't always go according to plan. And I could see, if anything, people using this as a reason to specifically dismiss any complaint at all from somebody with a lower end system, as an example. Meaning that if somebody had hardware well within specs but was still running into problems, and despite it not being a top-end machine, they still have a valid complaint there, and that honestly could just be used as a way to dismiss people with valid complaints just because they aren't running necessarily the bleeding edge. Another potential problem with this is that problems running a game could have absolutely nothing to do with anything I've mentioned up to this point, or that could realistically be captured within Steam metrics. So it could be a program or something you have running that is entirely unrelated to anything I've just mentioned. Like, it could be a firewall of all things preventing, say, an errant connection to the internet when a game starts up that crashes it. Another potential issue is just straight up computer literacy. I mean, like it or not, a lot of people use Steam, and they use it simply because it's the biggest platform, even though they don't necessarily know much about computers, and thus explaining a bunch of hardware to them that they don't understand the meaning of obviously isn't going to be helpful to those people. And I would actually be willing to bet that that's probably most of them, considering that realistically most of the people watching a video like this on a channel like this are going to be more invested in these things than your average person who doesn't necessarily know what any of the standard terms mean, and if anything, they might find it more confusing than helpful. And those are really just a handful of examples of reasons this might not necessarily work as well as it would obviously be intended to. So all of that to say, finally here at the end, this is one of those changes that I would like to see personally quite a bit, because it would help me, because I would know what to do with this information. But on the flip side of that, a lot of people might not be comfortable revealing this information, which would obviously be handled by opt-in and everything, and then all of the other issues that I mentioned. So again, there's a lot of nuance here, and if anything, I do think Steam is in a very unique position to potentially deal with stuff like this. It would just be a matter of, rolling it out and then iterating on that process over and over and over again before it got standardized to the point where it was, actually helpful on a game-to-game basis. But even then, that's with the full understanding that sometimes you might encounter problems that even this doesn't cover at all. And while it's easy to use a lot of that stuff to hand-wave away problems like this and say, why do it at all because of all of these issues we have, all of these things that could go wrong. And yeah, fair enough, it is extremely easy to choose to do nothing instead of choosing to do something. But personally, I think iterating on something like this would be a worthwhile pursuit that I think Steam is especially well positioned to actually tackle, because they could potentially centralize all that information for people. But again, I don't think this will ever actually happen. I just think it would be extremely cool to see. And frankly, a man can dream. But that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. Just a whole lot of thoughts and discussion on this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Mostly just me rambling. By all means, let me know what you think about it down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.